A black lady left a note on a damaged car. It belonged to a billionaire Korean mafia boss. The sickening screech of metal against metal echoed through the damp garage, a sound so violent it felt like it was tearing through Talia's own skin. She pulled her hand back as if the obsidian black car had burned her, her breath hitching in a throat that had suddenly gone bone dry. The heavy silver ring, a family heirloom she usually wore for luck, had become a weapon of financial destruction. In the dim, flickering light of the parking structure, the damage was blinding, a jagged, silver scar nearly 5 inches long, cutting straight through the custom porcelain finish of a vehicle that clearly belonged to the city's elite. "No, no, please, not today," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as her hands. She looked down at her portfolio, which lay sprawled on the oil-stained concrete. The sketches she had labored over for weeks, the logos that were supposed to be her ticket out of a cycle of overdue rent and predatory late fees, suddenly looked like worthless scraps of paper. She was already 25 minutes late for the interview. The door to that corporate office had likely already closed, and now, she had just opened a much more dangerous one. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A rational person might have looked at the empty corners of the garage, noted the lack of witnesses, and disappeared into the rainy Seattle mist. But Talia Grant wasn't built for the easy exit. Her father's voice, steady and stern even years after his passing, echoed in her mind. Integrity isn't what you do when the world is watching, it's what you do when you're certain no one is. With shaking fingers, she knelt among her ruined sketches, pulling a single blank sheet from the back of her portfolio. She didn't have a proper pen, only a charcoal pencil she used for shading. The rain-chilled air bit at her shoulders, exposed by the bold red dress she'd bought to feel powerful, a dress that now felt like a target. "I am so incredibly sorry," she wrote, the charcoal smudging under the heat of her frantic grip. "I tripped and my ring caught the door. I know this car is priceless, but I want to make it right. Please contact me." She scribbled her name and her cell phone number, each digit feeling like a confession. As she tucked the folded paper under the heavy, sleek windshield wiper, she felt the weight of the blinking red security camera in the corner. She didn't look up at it, but she felt its gaze, a cold, digital witness to her honesty. She took one last, pained look at the silver gouge in the black paint, a $10,000 mistake she couldn't afford, and ran toward the exit, unaware that on the top floor of the building, a man was already zooming in on the curls of her hair and the defiant set of her jaw. Let's take a pause. Kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments section where you are listening from. Thank you. Now let's continue. Talia ran until her lungs burned, the rain slicking her hair and blurring the world around her, but no amount of speed could outrun the crushing weight of the last 10 minutes. By the time she reached the glass and steel monolith of the design firm, the lobby clock mocked her with a silent, glowing red, 32 minutes late. She tried to smooth her damp dress and catch her breath, but the receptionist's gaze was a wall of polite ice. The interview was over before she had even opened her portfolio. The creative director had already moved on, and Talia was sent back out into the cold, a broken resume, personified, her dreams of stability washing down the gutter with the Seattle rain. 2 hours later, she sat in a cramped, dimly lit booth at a local diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease filling the air. Her best friend, Tasha Reed, sat across from her, pushing a plate of untouched fries toward her. Tasha was the only one who knew how thin the ice was beneath Talia's feet. How this job had been the last line of defense against an eviction notice. "I left a note, Tasha," Talia whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the charcoal-stained tips of her fingers. "I scratched a car that probably costs more than my life, and then I missed the only chance I had to pay for it. I'm invisible, until I mess up. Then suddenly, I'm the main attraction of a disaster." Tasha reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You did the right thing. Most people would have vanished. That honesty has to count for something, T. Honesty doesn't pay for custom obsidian paint," Talia countered, a bitter laugh escaping her. "It just leaves a paper trail to my front door. As they stepped out of the diner and onto the glistening sidewalk, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. The ambient noise of the city seemed to dampen, replaced by the low, predatory hum of an approaching engine. A massive, jet-black SUV with windows so dark they looked like voids pulled slowly to the curb, cutting off their path. Tasha instinctively stepped in front of Talia, but the back door swung open with a heavy, mechanical click. A man stepped out, not the owner of the car, but a driver in a sharp black suit whose posture screamed military precision. He didn't look at Tasha, his eyes locked onto Talia with unsettling accuracy. "Ms. Talia Grant?" he asked, his voice a low, emotionless rumble. Talia felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't even been home yet. She hadn't told anyone but Tasha. Yet, here they were, the shadows finally catching up to the girl in the red dress. High above the rain-slicked streets, in a sanctuary of glass and cold ambition, Tae-jin Kwon sat in total darkness. The only light in the room came from a massive, curved monitor that bathed his sharp features in a pale, spectral blue. On the screen, the grainy feed from a garage security camera played in a seamless, hypnotic loop. Most men in his position would have been looking at the damage, the jagged silver streak on the obsidian black door that would require a specialist from Italy to fix. But Tae-jin wasn't looking at the car. He was looking at the girl. He leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the desk, his eyes narrowed in calculation. He had watched the sequence 40 times. He watched the moment her shoulder clipped the pillar, the way her portfolio burst open like a dying bird, and the frantic, clumsy grace of her movements as she tried to gather her life from the concrete. He saw the exact second the ring made contact with the paint, the way her body stiffened, a physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated horror. In his world, the first instinct of any living creature was survival through deception. If a man hit his car, he would flee. If a rival made a mistake, they would burn the evidence. But Talia Grant was a glitch in his reality. He watched her head whip around, searching the empty garage. She wasn't looking for the camera. Not once did her eyes drift to the corner where the red light blinked. She wasn't checking to see if she could get away with it, she was looking for a person to apologize to. When she knelt in the oily shadows to write that note, her hands shaking so violently he could almost feel the vibration through the screen, Tae-jin felt a strange, unfamiliar spark of intrigue. She was terrified, broke, and alone, yet she chose the one path that led to her own ruin. Integrity, he realized, was a much more dangerous thing than malice. By the time she tucked the paper under the wiper and disappeared into the rain, Tae-jin already had her name, her address, and the heartbreaking details of her failed interview. She thought she was leaving a note on a car, she didn't realize she was signing a contract with a man who had never seen anything quite as radiant as her desperation. He tapped a key, freezing the frame on her expressive, wide eyes. Honesty, he murmured into the silence, his voice a low, predatory silk. Let's see what it's worth. The drive to Kwan Tower was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt subterranean. Talia sat in the back of the jet-black SUV, her fingers digging into the fabric of her yellow dress as the city lights blurred into long, distorted streaks against the tinted glass. When the vehicle finally hummed to a halt, she was led through a private entrance and into an elevator that ascended with a speed that made her ears pop and her stomach drop. This wasn't just a building. It was a fortress of glass and steel, a monument to a level of power that Talia had only ever seen from the sidewalk, looking up. The doors slid open to reveal the penthouse floor, a space of minimalist, intimidating luxury. There were no traditional walls, only floor-to-ceiling glass that made it feel as though the entire city of Seattle was laid out as a rug beneath someone's feet. At the far end of the room, behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark marble, sat Tae-jin Kwon. As Talia approached, the sound of her heels on the polished floor seemed to echo for miles. Tae-jin didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a document, his sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He looked exactly as he had in the shadows of her mind, precise, controlled, and devastatingly elegant in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms that hinted at a much more violent life than that of a content strategist. When he finally lifted his gaze, the air in the room seemed to vanish. His eyes were not cold, as she had expected, but possessed an unsettling, predatory intensity that made Talia feel like she was being analyzed down to her very soul. She waited for the lecture, the demand for money, or the threat. Instead, he simply gestured to the chair across from him. "You have a very expensive habit of telling the truth, Ms. Grant," he said, his voice a deep, smooth baritone that sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. Talia swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his unwavering stare. "I didn't think I had a choice. I damaged your property." "Choice is a luxury most people in this city discard the moment things get difficult," Tae-jin countered, leaning forward. The movement brought him into the light, and for a second, the sheer magnetism of his presence made Talia's head spin. The chemistry between them was immediate and dangerous, a volatile mix of her raw, honest vulnerability and his dark, calculated power. "I've spent all day looking at your designs, Talia. You're talented. But I'm more interested in the fact that you're the only person in a 10-mile radius who isn't a liar. That makes you very valuable to me." The transition from the cold, clinical silence of the Kwan Tower to the suffocating opulence of the Metropolitan Gala was so jarring that Talia felt as though she had been plunged into ice water. She had expected a desk, a computer, and perhaps a stack of non-disclosure agreements. Instead, she found herself draped in silk and standing at Tae-jin's elbow in a ballroom that dripped with crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive perfume. This was her first task. To be his shadow, his assistant, and to observe a world she was never meant to inhabit. Tae-jin moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark in a tank of goldfish. He didn't speak much, but he didn't have to. Talia watched with growing unease as the titans of Seattle's industry, men whose faces she recognized from the covers of Forbes, visibly stiffened the moment Tae-jin approached. The laughter in the room didn't stop, but it became brittle, forced and high-pitched. She noticed the way hands trembled as they reached out to shake his, and how eyes darted to the floor, avoiding his level, predatory gaze. "They aren't respecting him," Talia whispered, leaning closer to Tae-jin as a prominent real estate mogul practically tripped over his own feet to clear a path for them. "They're terrified." A ghost of a smile touched Tae-jin's lips, though he never looked away from the crowd. "Fear is just respect that has been stripped of its pretension, Talia. It's a much more stable currency in this room." As the evening wore on, the businessman persona Talia had tried to believe in began to crumble. She saw the way Tae-jin's security detail, led by the stoic June Park, didn't just watch the perimeter, they watched the guests like snipers marking targets. She saw a man in a tuxedo try to whisper something to Tae-jin, only to be silenced by a single, chilling look that sent the man scurrying into the shadows, his face drained of all color. Talia's hand instinctively went to her grandmother's silver ring, twisting it nervously. The scratch she had left on his car was a minor wound compared to the atmosphere of silent violence Tae-jin carried with him. She was no longer just an assistant to a billionaire, she was a witness to a king who ruled through shadows, and for the first time, she realized that being chosen by such a man was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. The champagne in Talia's flute felt as heavy as lead as she navigated the outskirts of the ballroom, trying to maintain the composed, professional mask Tae-jin expected. But the predatory peace of the evening was shattered when a man with a cruel, narrow face and a suit that cost more than Talia's hometown blocked her path. Sukjin Ryu didn't look at Talia with fear, he looked at her with the clinical disgust one might reserve for a smudge on a masterpiece. He was Tae-jin's shadow rival, a man who dealt in the kind of filth Tae-jin usually managed to keep at arm's length. "So, this is the new assistant I've been hearing about." Sukjin's voice was a thin, oily rasp that made the hair on Talia's neck stand up. He leaned in close, his eyes raking over her yellow dress with insulting slowness. "Kwan used to have taste. Now, it seems he's picking up charity cases from the gutter to fill his office. Tell me, sweetheart, do you actually know how to take a memo, or are you just here to provide a little, ethnic variety to his portfolio? Talia's face burned, the insult stinging worse than the Seattle rain, but before she could find her voice, the air around them turned glacial. A heavy, warm hand landed on the small of her back, a touch that was both a claim and a warning. Tae-jin had appeared out of the crowd like a ghost, his presence so sudden and overwhelming that Suk-jin actually recoiled. Tae-jin didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He simply looked at Suk-jin with a gaze so devoid of humanity it made the earlier, respectful fear of the ballroom look like a playground game. Ryu, Tae-jin murmured, his voice a low, lethal silk that vibrated through Talia's spine. You've mistaken my patience for a lack of memory. You will apologize to Ms. Grant. Now. It was just a joke, Tae-jin, Suk-jin began, his bravado evaporating into a frantic sweat. I don't tell jokes, Tae-jin interrupted, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly against Talia's waist, drawing her flush against his side. The protective energy radiating from him was terrifyingly beautiful, a raw, unchecked power deployed solely in her defense. And I don't permit garbage to speak in the presence of my assets. Apologize, or I will ensure you never have the breath to insult anyone again. As Suk-jin stammered a humiliated apology and fled, Talia looked up at Tae-jin. His jaw was tight, his eyes still fixed on the rivals retreating back with the focus of a sniper. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just working for him, she had become the only thing in his world he considered worth guarding, and the intensity of that protection was more intoxicating than any wine in the room. The gala's high-tension theater felt like a fever dream once Talia was back within the silent, glass-walled confines of Kwan Tower. It was past midnight, and the city below had dissolved into a sea of shimmering amber lights. In the executive suite, the only sound was the soft scratching of Talia's stylus against her tablet and the rhythmic click of Tae-jin's keyboard. This was the crimson and ink of their shared reality, her vibrant, creative world bleeding into his dark, calculated one. Talia was deep in a flow state, her bold yellow dress a sharp contrast to the minimalist black leather chair. She didn't notice Tae-jin rise from his desk until he was standing directly behind her, his presence a sudden wave of heat in the air-conditioned room. He leaned over, his eyes scanning the intricate branding concepts she had developed for his newest venture. You use color like a weapon, Tae-jin murmured, his voice low and vibrating near her ear. Most designers play it safe. You provoke. I think the world has enough beige, Talia replied, her breath hitching as she looked up. In the intimate glow of the monitor, she noticed something she hadn't seen in the harsh light of the ballroom. As Tae-jin reached forward to point at a specific logo, his cuff slid back, revealing a jagged, puckered scar that ran from his wrist up into the darkness of his sleeve. It wasn't a surgical mark, it was a relic of violence. Talia's hand instinctively reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ancient wound before she caught herself. Tae-jin didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his arm slightly, letting the light catch the silvered skin. A reminder that honesty is expensive, Talia. Just like your note. The professional line didn't just blur, it vanished. In that moment, Talia saw past the billionaire strategist and the Mafia king to the man who had survived a world designed to break him. When she finally looked back at her sketches, the ink seemed darker, the yellow more intense. She wasn't just designing a brand anymore, she was beginning to understand the man behind the shadow, and the realization was more terrifying, and more alluring, than any debt she owed him. The velvet silence of the tower was replaced 48 hours later by the sharp, metallic echo of a waterfront shipping yard. Tae-jin had brought Talia along to a high-stakes negotiation under the guise of her taking field notes for a new logistics brand identity, but as the salty wind whipped her red dress against her legs, she realized this was no corporate meeting. Standing in the shadow of towering steel containers, Tae-jin faced a group of men whose eyes held the same cold assessment she had seen in the gala ballroom. Among them was a frantic-looking associate of Suk-jin, Ryu, sweating despite the midnight chill. Tae-jin moved to the center of the yard to inspect a crate, leaving Talia near the darkened edge of a warehouse. To the men in the center, she was just a fixture, a pretty assistant meant to be ignored. It was this invisibility, the very thing she had hated all her life, that became her greatest asset. From the shadows, she caught the muffled, urgent whispers of two men standing behind a nearby forklift. The signal happens when he reaches for the manifest, one hissed, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Kwon thinks he's here for a deal, but he's walking into a grave. Ryu wants him handled tonight. Talia's blood turned to ice. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched Tae-jin. He looked so calm, so untouchably powerful as he stood beneath the swinging harbor lights, completely unaware of the barrel leveled at his back from the upper catwalk. In that heartbeat, the professional lines she had tried to draw were obliterated by a raw, terrifying choice. She knew Tae-jin was a monster to the rest of the world, a man of shadows and scars. But he was also the man who had protected her, who had seen her talent, and who had valued her honesty when she was at her lowest. If she stayed silent, the debt was gone. She could walk away, return to her ordinary life, and forget she ever touched that obsidian car. But as Tae-jin's hand reached toward the manifest, Talia realized she couldn't live with a silence that cost a life. "Tae-jin, move," she screamed, her voice tearing through the industrial quiet. The sound of her cry was instantly followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot splintering the wooden crate exactly where his head had been a second before. The yard erupted into chaos, but as Tae-jin dove for cover, his eyes didn't find the shooter, they found her, wide and terrified in the dark, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine, human fear in his gaze. Not for himself, but for the girl who had just traded her safety for his. The adrenaline from the shipyard confrontation had barely cooled before the walls of Kwon Tower felt like they were closing in. Tae-jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, his back to Talia, his silhouette a jagged blade against the flickering skyline. The silence was no longer the comfortable, creative hum they had shared over sketches, it was heavy, suffocating, and charged with a dark realization. For the first time in his life, Tae-jin's calculations had failed him. He had sought out Talia because her honesty was a rare asset, but now, that asset had become a liability. The only thing in the world that could make him hesitate. "You're leaving, Talia," he said, his voice a flat, dead cold that she had never heard him use toward her. "The debt is cancelled. The car, the job, the protection, it's over. June will have your things moved back to your apartment by morning." Talia stood her ground in the center of the room, her yellow dress torn at the hem and stained with the salt of the harbor, but her gaze was unshakable. "You're trying to fire me because I saved your life? Or is it because you realized you actually care if I live or die?" Tae-jin spun around, his composure finally snapping. In 3 long, predatory strides, he was in her space, his hands gripping the back of her chair so hard the leather groaned. "I am a monster, Talia. I deal in shadows and blood, and tonight, you almost bled for me. You are a weakness I cannot afford to have. My enemies saw you scream for me. They saw me look for you. That makes you a target, and it makes me slow. I won't have you on my conscience when Suk-jin Ryu finally decides to finish what he started." The obsession in his eyes was unbound, a raw, terrifying hunger that warred with his need for control. He was trying to push her away to save her, but Talia saw the lie in his coldness. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cuff of his shirt, near the scar they had looked at just nights before. "I don't leave things unfinished, Tae-jin," she whispered, her voice a low, steady anchor in his storm. "You told me honesty is expensive. Well, I'm not done paying. You hired me for 3 months, and I'm staying for 3 months. You don't get to decide when I'm safe. I chose to stay in that garage, and I'm choosing to stay now. You're not the only one in this room who knows how to fight for what matters." Tae-jin stared at her, his jaw tight, his breath hitching as he realized that the shy girl was gone. He had intended to own her, to use her integrity as a tool, but he had ended up enslaved by his own need for her. He wanted to scream at her to run, to save herself from the darkness he carried, but when she didn't flinch, he knew he had lost. She was no longer just an assistant or a debt to be settled, she was the only light he had ever known, and he was too far gone to let it go. The city of Seattle lay beneath them like a sprawling map of light and shadow, but for the first time, Talia Grant didn't feel like a tiny, insignificant speck lost within its grid. Standing on the reinforced glass balcony of the Quan Tower, she wore a new kind of armor, a tailored suit of deep crimson that matched the fire in her eyes. Beside her, Taejin Quan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, no longer the predator hunting a glitch, but a king acknowledging his equal. The 3 months had long since passed, but the debt had been transformed into a partnership that the underworld was only beginning to fear. Talia looked down at the tablet in her hand, swiping through the final rebranding of the Quan Syndicate. She hadn't just changed a logo, she had restructured the way Taejin moved through the world. By utilizing her graphic design expertise to create legitimate fronts and sophisticated information networks, she had turned his raw, violent power into an elegant, untouchable empire. She was no longer the girl who tripped in a garage, she was the architect of his public grace and his private strength. "The board is meeting at midnight," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors that once defined her. "Sukjin Ryu's assets have been neutralized, not by bullets, but by the legal web I've woven around his imports. He's finished, Taejin." Taejin turned to her, the moonlight catching the sharp angle of his jaw and the softened intensity in his dark eyes. He reached out, his warm, strong hand covering her own on the balcony railing. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle over the silver ring she still wore, a reminder of where they began. "I told you that you were a weakness I couldn't afford," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "I was wrong. You are the only reason this empire has a future worth holding." When they walked back into the boardroom together, the heavy doors swinging open to reveal the city's most dangerous players, the silence that fell was different than before. It wasn't just fear directed at the man in the charcoal suit, it was a profound, stunned realization of the woman at his side. As Talia took her seat at the head of the table, opening her portfolio to reveal the future of the city, she realized the shy girl in the corner was finally gone. She had left a note on a car and ended up claiming a throne, and as her eyes met Taejin's across the room, she knew that this was just the beginning of their reign. The world finally saw her, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid to be seen. Kindly subscribe to my channel and follow for more interesting stories. Thank you.